Governor Busbee, Mrs. Johnson, President Davidson, Dean Baird, ladies and gentlemen. A wise man told me when I was very young that a strong man will ignore it if evil things are said behind his back, but he will never forgive anyone who utters excessive flattery to his face. For that reason, I shall today exercise much more constraint in what I say about Dean Rusk than might otherwise be the case, or might indeed correspond to my full feelings. It's a very great pleasure to be here today. It's always a pleasure to be present at the dedication of a new educational center, particularly in such a vital field as international and comparative law. It's always a very great pleasure to be present, to participate in honoring a man of quality, a man of great distinction. And when those two events are combined in one, as they are today, that adds a special dimension of felicity. I feel all of this particularly strongly. I have most valid reasons for feeling as I do about Dean Rusk, because for 6 years he was my friend and my mentor. I sat at his feet occasionally through inadvertence. I sometimes trod on his toes. But in any event, we saw one another through a very difficult, very significant period. Dean Rusk, all his life, has been a teacher, whether he has been in an academic world, the head of a great foundation, or indeed as Secretary of State. And he has those qualities, it seems to me, which are most essential in a teacher. He has insight, and he also has patience. The fact that he has patience and compassion were demonstrated at a very early time in his career as Secretary of State, because 2 or 3 days after he had been sworn in, he came to this very large edifice which houses the diplomatic establishment of the United States, and a very young Foreign Service officer was designated to take him about this building where one needs a guide or he could be lost for weeks, to take him about this building and introduce him to the heads of the various bureaus and divisions of the State Department. And the young man did his job with considerable grace, but for one thing, wherever he went, he would say, "Now, Dean, let's go in here. And Dean, I suggest you sit down there. Now, Dean, it's time for you to speak," and so on. And this caused considerable consternation amongst his fellows, who said, "What is this young man up to? He only just met the Secretary of State this morning, and given the high degree of protocol that exists in the diplomatic service, that is scarcely the way for him to get ahead." And it was only till later on that the young man discovered that Dean was not a title of academic distinction, which the Secretary had bought with him, but his first name. Nevertheless, he was forgiven, and indeed he was promoted. The time that I served with Dean Rusk, that he was my chief, covered a span of almost 6 years. There was a later addition when I served briefly as ambassador to the United Nations under his tutelage. It was a time when I learned a great deal, but also lost a great deal of sleep. In fact, if I ever understood the meaning of indefatigable, it was not only and not nearly as much what I tried to do myself as to what I saw the Secretary of State indeed accomplishing. He was well aware that this was the regimen to which both he and I would have to accustom ourselves when he was first appointed, because as the second or third day that I was serving with him, he said, "You know, I must warn you of something." He said, "You and I are in for a very bad time, a very rocky time, because What many people fail to realize is that at any given moment, 2/3 of the world is awake. And you can be sure that somebody out there is planning or executing some devilish act which is going to get you and me into very great difficulties. Well, that in fact was the case. The Secretary slept with 4 telephones by his bed, and I think I had as many, and there was rarely a night that one or both of us wasn't interrupted one time or more. And I very well remember at the early morning staff meetings, the Secretary coming in and looking rather wistfully around the room at all the assembled heads of the bureaus of the department and saying, "Why can't one of you sometime do me a favor? Why can't you call me up at 3 o'clock in the morning with some good news?" As I told you, I do not intend to indulge in excessive flattery with regard to Dean Rusk or excessive praise, although I think the word excessive is not very appropriate, because there are a few things I could say about him of praise that wouldn't indeed be true. But I shall content myself to commenting on 2 or 3 of the traits of character which most distinguished the Secretary as I saw them during the period that I served with him. One of them was the fact that while he had assurance, had confidence in his own judgment, and was quite prepared to take the consequences of putting his ideas into practice, nonetheless, he recognized that he was not in all things infallible. This is a judgment which not all men in high public life always achieve. He recognized that there could be areas of important substantive opinion where men of goodwill could differ. And when early on I expressed on one area of policy some dissent from his, he said to me, "George, I want you to understand one thing." He said, "The President is as entitled to your views as he is to mine. I never hesitate to express it." Well, with respect to one area of policy, I took that advice. I carried it through assiduously. And I think that President Johnson, who was a man who, in spite of some impressions, quite wrong impressions to the contrary, was very hospitable to dissenting ideas, to differing ideas, because he was so eager in his search for the truth, for what was right to do. I followed this through, somewhat, I think, to the astonishment of some of our friends, because later there was a comment in Washington by one of the columnists that Ball could not have differed with the Secretary of State, could not have differed with his chief, and expressed that difference to the President had he been deputy to one or two of the cabinet members. In fact, they added, and this, I confess, has disturbed me very much, he probably could never have expressed those views to the President had he been deputy to Ball. On this last point, let me say I am not at all sure. And I have from time to time pondered rather sadly as to just what the answer would be if the question were ever really put to the test. I know of no one in my experience who has ever felt a higher sense of duty in his performance as a public servant. And I suppose in a way that it's totally appropriate but significant that the man whom he always referred to as his greatest model, his greatest mentor, was General Marshall, with whom he had served at the time when General Marshall was Secretary of State. And rather like General Marshall, Secretary of Rusk refused to try to exploit his own talents in the public eye when he could accomplish something very much better by the workings of quiet diplomacy. In fact, it was one of his characteristics that he never tried to identify policy with his own personality. It may well have been that he would have gotten a much better press at times if he had made that identification, because to many of the correspondents, he appeared rather reserved. He rarely let this extraordinary humor of his appear. He wanted to talk about the issues, the problems that faced the United States. He didn't want to talk about himself. For this reason, he didn't provide the fodder for newspaper coverage that many other personalities did, who were quite prepared to see policies, so to speak, personified through their own projection of their own personalities. I don't think this was solely modesty. I think it was the kind of a reserve of a Georgia gentleman. I think it was the sense of the importance of the great task that had been given to him as Secretary of State. I think it was deference to one of the two strong presidents with whom he and I both served. But it was a quality which I could not help but admire, because I think he knew as well as I that it was very easy to have exploited his personality and perhaps been more enthusiastically received by the press, who regarded him with respect, but never with really easy cordiality. This was something he felt was required of a Secretary of State, and I think in many ways he was right. Dean Rusk was a practitioner of diplomacy, believed in quiet diplomacy. He believed in working with other nations, trying to persuade the heads of state of other nations. And he rejected the flamboyant element, which has from time to time marked our diplomacy both before and after he sat in the chair of the Secretary of State. He also believed that diplomacy could be conducted effectively without the assiduous use of jet airplanes, which is something that secretaries before and since have not necessarily followed. He recognized that within the State Department, within the whole diplomatic apparatus of the United States, the establishment overseas, our embassies, our missions, our envoys around the world, that there was a vast amount of talent, and that decisions could not and should not be made by the Secretary without fully drawing on that talent, and that policies could not be effectively utilized without using that talent in the representation of the United States interests to the maximum. This again was something that seems to me of very high importance, because we have from time to time had as Secretaries of State men who have felt that they alone could conduct diplomacy, that they alone could carry out policy. And during those periods, the Department of State has tended to be vulnerable to the kind of atrophy that comes to a muscle which is underused. I know of no one in recent years who has understood better the capacity for wisdom that exists in a great bureaucratic institution such as the Department of State if it is properly utilized, or the capacity for carrying out policy which exists in such institution if there is a willingness to delegate authority and a willingness to recognize that the head of the institution is not the only man of competence, not the only man who can carry out policy for the United States. It's for this reason that when Secretary Rusk went abroad, he always said to me, "You are now the Secretary of State. While I am away, I do not carry the keys of my office with me when I leave the United States." Obviously, to his deputy, as I was, this was an extremely gratifying comment. But of course, it was based on the fact that he and I worked so closely together that he knew very well that I understood the lines of his policy and that I would not deviate from it, nor would I strike out on my own without full consultation with him. The relationship that he and I had together is one of the most fruitful periods, marks one of the most fruitful periods of my life. I could not have served under anyone for whom I would have had greater admiration. Yet there is one more quality of Dean Rusk that I might mention, and that is the quality of humility. There was a time when I was a little thrown off because I thought for a very brief moment that this might not be the case. Because he used to have a system when he received a telephone call that if it were a normal routine call, his secretary would ring the buzzer once, and he would take the call if he was able to do so. But one time when I was with him, the telephone rang twice, and he explained that that meant a call from the president. So he went into his conference room and took the call, and I grew adjusted to that idea. But finally, one day, when we were in the midst of a conversation, the buzzer rang 3 times. And I looked rather amazed. I said, "But you don't have a direct line there, too, do you?" And I was enormously relieved to find that he was as baffled by the 3rd ring as I was. Let me add just one point in these rather rambling reminiscences of Dean Rusk, and that is that he could not have served nearly as effectively as he did in the Department of State had it not been for another person who was quite as indefatigable, and that is Virginia Rusk, Mrs. Rusk. She was quite as assiduous as he. She was quite as careful to try to improve the understanding of other nations as he was. She went to 3 or 4 receptions a day, national days, as did my wife at the same time, because we told them at a very early age that a very early time when we were serving together that the secretary and I could not go to any without going to all, and therefore it was up to them. Virginia Rusk was universally revered by the diplomatic corps in Washington. She kept in touch with them. They loved her, and I can assure you that it was a very great asset for the United States to have her in that job. And finally, since Mrs. Johnson is here today, let me say that the most gratifying thing I think that both Dean Rusk and I enjoyed was the opportunity to serve under a very strong, very wise president, a president who was quite prepared to have us differ with him, but who knew in the end of the road that he would have the full support of those around him because he had the full confidence of those around him. I find this a very happy occasion indeed. I find it particularly fitting that Dean Rusk's name should be associated with a Center for International and Comparative Law, because one thing that was very clear in his approach to the whole task of helping to formulate a foreign policy with the president and to carry out that foreign policy was that all individual actions, all individual decisions had to be put in a larger framework. America was a country which looked out in all directions. Our relations extended to the farthest outpost of the globe. It was very clear that whatever we did was of importance far beyond that of almost any other nation because of our size, our resources, and therefore the influence that we had the capacity to exert. There were many temptations to a Secretary of State, particularly during this period. There were temptations to chase all kinds of rabbits, to pursue individual policies which seemed important. And one of the most important lessons that I learned from Dean Rusk was that this was no way to conduct policy. for a great nation, that whatever occurred had to be put in the framework of a larger policy, a larger strategy, that all things were not the same size, that there had to be an order of priorities, and that there had to be a kind of systematic approach to the questions of foreign policy and the questions of diplomacy, which again have not always been present in our diplomacy. So I thank all of you here today who've come to participate in the dedication of this center and to do honor to Dean Rusk. And I am delighted to have the opportunity to share this occasion with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ball. Accompanying Mr. Ball to...
I believe our medical care is way ahead of them. Our standard of living is, of course, remarkably ahead of them, and that impresses them. Their standard of living has declined in the last 5 years, and they've lost ground. The $250, by the way, is what it costs to make the flight. $250 room, board, and tuition. That's all expenses. And that makes it available to the low-income groups. $250 is a lot of money to them, much more than it is to an American. And by the way, in getting this cross-section of people up, we have to go and get them sometimes because, you know, a lot of these low-income people over here are not accustomed to foreign travel. They don't know anything about it. They don't think in that term. So you have to go invite them. You have to go find them. And then you interview them and see if they'd be compatible, and they'd make good ambassadors. But that thought never occurs to them. It will in the future as they read about it in the press and see it on television.